Today I'm going to be talking about the emotional side of communication, and the last 2 days it's actually been great because people have already softened you up for the concept of the emotional side of things. Now, my boss is fairly rational, and there are times I wish he were not quite so rational because I really would appreciate it sometimes he would just do as I tell him rather than asking me why, but unfortunately he usually wants data or something like that for me to explain the method to my madness. He doesn't always, although Richard, of course, too, is a human being, he's not Spock and has his emotional side as well. Earlier today we heard James Croft, and I just thought his talk was very good. The workshop was interesting, and talking about those 3 legs of persuasion of logos, ethos, and pathos. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the pathos side. And communication always is a bit of persuasion. It's a way of trying to change, not necessarily someone's mind, but give them a piece of information that they don't already have, converse about something. And so there's always that little bit of art of persuasion in it. And one of the things that James pointed out was that as skeptics, we tend to think or see ourselves as being particularly rational, which is why we tend to like the logos side of things a little better. And I'm going to have to disagree a little bit with James on this one. Yes, we tend to be very rational, but we can also be as irrational as anyone else. We're very good at looking at rational arguments, but I would say, and I'll make this point a little clearer later on, that we use our emotional selves, our not so rational selves, most of the time throughout the day. And that might bother you a little bit, but the fact is we have to force ourselves to be rational. We have to force ourselves to go through that argument. Now, we can train ourselves to be a little bit better at it, especially when it comes to our particular area of expertise. But the fact is, our daily lives, how we go about it, is still fairly emotionally based. So, humans are incredibly social. We are the most social species on this planet. And our communications are incredibly complicated. I'm going to be getting into that. And in fact, our brains are ready to start understanding communications from about the time we pop out of the womb. We start communicating, we start learning about communication very, very early on. Our brains are geared for it. And because humans use communication as our main way of socializing, of course it would be something that's very complex. And with humans, we use words, we use language, which makes humans very, very unique. But we also use a lot of nonverbal communications. As all of you know, most of you know this, and I'm going to be going over some things that you guys already know, but I'm going to highlight them to make my point. But we have facial expressions and body language and intonation, as James mentioned in his previous talk, and of course we use words. And in fact, nonverbal communication is actually most of what we use in communication. And that may seem surprising, but it's true. And you need to think about, throughout the entire day, we're using nonverbal communication. So only about 7% of our communication are actual words, which means that's the sort of logic that we use in order to get our point across. A lot of the other things that we're using to get our point across are these nonverbal indicators. So I'm going to go back, because I'm an evolutionary psychologist, so I always have to go back to Darwin, because we tend to think of emotion in a negative way, right? He's emotional, she's emotional, and it's not a compliment. But the fact is, our emotions evolved for an extraordinarily good reason. Darwin pointed this out. Has anyone here read The Expressions of Emotions by Yeah, it's an excellent book. I mean, he was, again, I mean, Darwin was way ahead of his time. And these are images from his book. And you can imagine how disturbing this was to the Victorian mind, comparing the expressions of chimpanzees and dogs and cats to humans. But again, drawing that point that we are evolved from the same roots. So from an evolutionary perspective, emotions evolved to enhance our survival. And this is true of other animals as well as us. But we brought it to a new level, again, because we've included language. But language, small part of it. We've if you think about the interactions you've had over the last couple of weeks in terms of who you've met, whether it be strangers or friends or your partner, think about how just the way they look you walk into a room and it's someone you know very well, and you can immediately say, you might say, what's wrong? Before they even speak, you get that emotion from them immediately. And you go into Starbucks, and did you smile at the barista? Did you say good morning? Or were you sort of grumpy because you haven't had your morning coffee, which is usually me? And how did that affect the person on the other side of the counter? All these things are going on constantly during the day. We constantly are getting feedback and information from the people we interact with. And what's kind of interesting about humans, and this is where the logic goes out the window, when we're in a bad mood, we think of it, the causes as being internal. It's because we had a bad email when we woke up. Our boss called us at 3 in the morning to ask what happened to a report. I mean, something's happened, and so we are in a bad mood. But it's because of an outside force has come in. But when someone else is in a bad mood, it's them, right? That's our first response. Oh, they're just grumpy. They're just not nice. Someone who's not nice, especially if it's somebody we've never met before. We just immediately see their reaction as being internalized. That's not particularly logical. Yet, this is how most humans go about their day. So, getting back to what emotions do for us, they organize our behavior. We're reacting to the emotions we see on other people's faces. It enhances our survival by allowing us to solve problems. If we're in a large social group, being able to see how the other members and reading their expressions, is the social group downtrodden? Are they exhausted? Are they happy? You can gauge what's going on. Seeing what your partner's doing. Are they unhappy? Are they unhappy with you? Is there something you need to do to make that person more happy so that they don't leave? There's all sorts of reasons we want to be able to gauge these emotions. And plus, they're unavoidable. I mean, they evolved for a reason. We go through our lives with these emotions. We don't, and James pointed this out, we would not survive as Spock. It's that simple. But the thing is, especially, and I do think this is true among rationalists and skeptics and atheists, we tend to think that we're not so influenced by emotions. But the fact is that we actually are. And emotions are a double-edged sword. There's the good side. It allows us to fall in love. It allows us to love our children. It allows us to form friendships. It allows us to engage with people in meaningful conversation. But it also can trigger things, sometimes the worst side of us. Sometimes it does trigger us becoming completely irrational. Now, all of you are going to be able to look at these images and immediately recognize what they are. Infants are programmed to always be looking at faces. And that's why in preemie care, when they're put into the neonatal unit and they're in the the little, they're boxed in, right? And they will put a picture of a face over the child's head. And they have found that by constantly having a face exposed to an infant, they do much better. And an infant's eyesight, in fact, is about, everything's fuzzy except for about 12 inches. And 12 inches is about from the mother's face to the infant's face when she is breastfeeding. So they come out looking at faces, and they will orientate towards faces. So if you take an infant and you give them different things to look at, boxes, colorful things, but you give them a face, even if it kind of looks like a face, they will orientate to it. And we know that we see faces all the time, right? You look at a grain of wood and you say, oh, look at that, it looks like an old man. Or look at that, it looks like a woman. Or it looks like a dog's face. We see it in clouds, we see it in toast. It's Jesus. So we're geared to see faces, and we're geared to easily read these incoming stimuli from faces. I mean, most of you know about Paul Ekman, and he studied how we read emotions, and we have happy, surprise, disgust, sad, and I love the baby face that is not a happy baby, right? That's angry. I mean, this is on an infant face. That baby's just angry. It's mad about something. We don't know what, but we want to make it better, right? So what does that do to mom or dad or babysitter? I mean, if this is your baby, and I know a lot of the students aren't going to have children, but those of you who do, you're going to do everything you can to fix that because you know what's coming next. And if you've been around a baby scream, baby screams, by the way, have a particular pitch that is most annoying to the human ear. And there's a reason for that. It evolved that way for a reason, because you are not going to ignore a baby's cry. So we know this, and we see it we react to these kinds of faces, and we can't ignore them. Now, the other thing that happens is we have what's called micro-expressions. And Paul Ekman, again, found this. And it's the same types of expressions I just showed you, only they're flickers. They're very brief flickers of expression. And they're very, very difficult to detect cognitively, but we detect them emotionally. Now, that's interesting, right? We don't cognitively detect them, we emotionally detect them. And so we're not very good at understanding why, from an individual perspective, why we might have an uncomfortable feeling with someone, or maybe why we like someone. And it's because we have these little micro-expressions. Now, here's contempt. And, and what Ekman points out, and there's other things too, but the lip cornered. And we've all seen these expressions of contempt. And you know when someone's kind of smirking at you. And yet, if you were to react by saying, what's your problem, or why are you like that? Oh, I didn't say anything, right? I didn't say anything, so you can't call me on it. Yet, this emotional aspect of our brain is calling them on it. So all the emotions I showed you on the page with the children, again, these come back in these micro expressions. And what's interesting with this is Ekman has actually worked with law enforcement in the UK, and these micro expressions, when put on videotape and allowing a computer to read them, much better than a lie detector test. They can actually, I mean, these are just a few of the expressions, but they can look at lying. If somebody's lying, what happens to their face? So it's interesting. But all of this is being connected to the emotional side of us. Body language, too. Again, James touched on this. But I used to work with a guy named Dave, and I always knew when I went into a meeting with him and his arms were like this, crossed across his chest, I knew I was going to have to do a lot of talking, and I would watch as his arms lowered and then finally would be put on the table. Aha, I've persuaded him to at least listen. But it's this body language, I'm not going to listen. And we recognize that. We recognize that. And we recognize that on a very basic level. People didn't actually have to tell you that, did you? I mean, you knew even as I mean, you know, because you do these things naturally. You're not even aware when you do them. It's very difficult to control these expressions of body and face. You have to be extraordinarily good. Poker face is not an easy thing to control, which is why we see poker players often wear sunglasses. It's because they don't want people reading their eyes, because a really good poker player, professional poker player, can read the dilation of the pupils and see that, you know, it's good or bad, and they get these tiny little bits of emotion from the person they're trying to read. Another one is intonation, how we say our words, loudly, softly, tight-lipped. Are we laughing? Are we choking back tears? These are all, again, things that we naturally tune into and that cause an emotional reaction. So let's get to words. Again, word choices. One-on-one conversation, word choices are going to be very different. If you know somebody very well and you're really good friends and you've known each other for a long time, I mean, there are probably times you can just look at each other because you have a shared history and start laughing because a similar situation has just come up and you're both thinking the same thing and you know it, right? Especially people who have been married for a long time or have had partners for a long time. They can just look at a partner across the room and they realize the situation. The look of, can we get out of here now, sort of thing. And so the one-on-one conversations, we use different sets of words. In small groups, again, we'll be using different words than if we're with friends, coworkers, bosses, strangers. We're going to speak differently to somebody we don't know than somebody we know very well. We're going to be the way we talk to our boss is not the way we talk to our best friend. Everybody knows that. But again, these are based on sort of emotional issues, right? Why should we have to talk to everybody? Why wouldn't we talk to everybody the same way? Well, because there are sort of these rules of how we talk to one another. And if you spoke to your boss the way you spoke to your friend, he or she would probably not be very happy with you. Then there's sex differences. And this is one of the areas that I have studied the most. And sex differences, we give off different signals. And this is, I'll refer back to the what ought and what is that Lauren mentioned earlier, just because evolution, don't shoot the messenger. Evolution did a few things with us in terms of our sex differences. And one of them is how we signal and how we read signals. There's also social and cultural expectancies, and that, of course, changes within each culture. And as men and women have come into the workforce, I mean, the changes in the last 35 years have been tremendous. Prior to the last 35 years, we were much, the sex roles or gender roles, however you want to phrase it, were fairly straightforward. As a couple raising a family, the wife and mother stayed home. She might have worked, but she still took care of the home, and father was basically the breadwinner, and dad, father, husband ruled the house. That's changed for the good, and we've had to, though, relearn how to use language. We have a long history of language and signals that we're having to reconstruct with a very, very fast change in our cultural world. I mean, this is 35 years is extraordinarily quick when you think about the changes that have happened in Western European countries with men and women. So while we need to learn to respect some of the natural differences. I'm going to give you an example. There is a grocery store chain who, this was about 10 years ago, I think. They wanted their, the people who work behind the counters and so on, to always smile. And the checkers tended to be mostly women. And they were, please smile and, make sure, give everybody a really big smile, and we'll judge you on those smiles. What happened, though, is the women started complaining to their managers that men were becoming a little overly friendly. Now, why was that? Well, men evolved to take signals of women's desire for them. They set those signals very low. In fact, so what I would tell my students is, if a guy went up to a woman and said, "Oh, would you please go out with me?" And she says, "Maybe if you were the last guy on Earth." He goes away and goes, "I have a chance," right? If there's a nuclear war and we're the only two people that survive, I'm there. So men evolved to take signals to a new level. And the reason why is, and again, you have to understand how evolutionary works. Let's say 99.9% of the women said, "You creep, get away from me," and he got nowhere. 0.1%, though, he got lucky. Those men who interpreted a signal for more than it probably really was, that very small percentage over hundreds of thousands of years meant that they interpreted the signal, meant that those men survived better. They probably had more offspring, and that gene for that interpretation managed to get into the male DNA. Does that mean we have to accept that? Well, it means that we need to respect it. And I don't mean respect it that men can be creeps. I mean respect it in understanding that we both have to learn from that. Women need to realize that they could be sending off signals that men misinterpret, and men need to realize that they can be misinterpreting signals that may just be a friendly smile. So you can imagine how something as simple as that can lead to all kinds of miscommunications and emotional reactions, especially in the workplace when women really were getting into the workplace. It was an issue. So the question is, how did we really become even successful at communicating with all these complications? Well, I want to do a thought experiment. What if we eliminated 93% of our communication signals? What if we communicated with complete strangers and often anonymously? What if we discussed complex personal and social issues? And let's posit the success and failure rates of accurate transmission of communication. Yeah, it's not a thought experiment, is it? It's the internet. It is rife with miscommunication problems. And unfortunately, this is where I have seen in the rational community the most emotional reactions that I would never see in a group like this. I would never see this type of emotional reaction in a group. So I asked the question, what's the difference between love and emails, blogs, and Facebook posts? You know the answer. Email, blogs, and Facebook posts last forever. Anything we write on that is there forever and can be used against us later. So this is a recipe for disaster, right? I mean, messages can be completely misinterpreted. Humor and sarcasm can fall flat and offend. Aggression and bullying are easier when we're anonymous and at a distance. Why? Because if you're not looking at the person, you're not getting that reaction. You're not seeing that you're causing distress. Plus, there's really no policing of posting. Now, oh, free speech. We're back to the free speech issue. And oh, I don't want any policing. I don't want anybody to tell us what we can and cannot say. That's terrific, except that's really not how social species work. We police ourselves. We are policing ourselves all the time. We're policing ourselves here. We're not saying things when maybe we're thinking thoughts, right? I mean, a child would be, when they're little, they just say whatever they feel like. Grandma, how come you have that big dot on your nose? Why are you so wrinkled? We contain our speech. We control ourselves. We police ourselves because we are seeing the reactions of other people. When we look at autistics and people with Asperger's, they don't read those emotional signals, so they sometimes say things that seem really, really awkward, and they have a difficult time in social settings. And even with these annoying little emoticons, we still have problems, and I do find them annoying, but at times, I do the smiley face, like this is really just a joke, because we realize that the person cannot hear our intonation. They cannot see our face as we're laughing. They can't see that because we're just sending an email or a blog. The other issue in general when we're talking about communications is egocentrism. And we naturally have a difficulty of taking someone else's perspective because we're us. And other people's perspective comes from their world, but our world, we interpret everything through our experiences, our history. So it's sometimes very difficult to get into someone else's head. We have loss of tone, facial expressions, and other nonverbal communications, as I mentioned, when we're on the internet, and then plus having this egocentrism, we've completely lost it. We have no way of understanding what someone may really mean. And experiments by Kruger et al. Show, in fact, that people on the internet misjudge, overestimate their ability to correctly communicate and that other people understand them. So we have data that show that we do this. There's also this bias, the bias of understanding. I'm not saying any of you are guilty, but I've done this. When someone has said something to me, and let's say I'm not very happy with them at the moment, I may bias my interpretation of what they said to me because I'm unhappy, I think they're being a jerk, and so they could say something completely innocuous, and I may interpret it the wrong way. And I think a lot of people can fall into this trap. We all have sensitivity issues, right? We all have a history, we all have a past, so some things are going to tap into us a little stronger than others. And so someone may say something, they don't know your history, they don't know that you're very sensitive about a particular issue or something, or when someone says the word. I hate the word stupid, because that was a word my father used. And so if someone uses the word stupid, I can feel the hackles on the back of my neck. But they don't know that about me. And so we have these hot buttons. And the other thing that we tend to do, because we don't have this natural interaction with people, is we tend to go on to these personal attacks. It's much easier to attack someone you don't see, right? Much easier, because you're not looking at the hurt that you've just caused, or the fact they can't punch you in the nose, which is another possibility. So can we be rational about emotions? Well, I think we can be. This goes to the ought and is. We can be self-aware of our emotions. We can understand that something that happened earlier that morning is causing us to behave in a certain way. Maybe we've been sitting in traffic for an hour and a half, and so we're in a bad mood. We can try to take the position of other. We can take the Robert Kennedy approach, which is to ignore someone's antagonistic comment and take the more positive one. Stop before writing or saying something that could be misconstrued or cause harm. Reread your sentence and think about how someone else might interpret it. Sometimes just a comma can make all the difference in the world. And if angry, wait to speak, and especially wait to write. Never write in anger. You can write it to yourself and keep it, but then go and delete it. let the anger out, but don't send it. Not everything needs to be a debate. We can have discussions. And as James mentioned, finding points of agreement. Listen to the other side. Appeal to the emotions through empathy. These are all things that James touched on. De-escalate. De-escalate the situation, whether it be on the internet, phone call, or personal discussion. And be willing to walk away. I think that's one of the most important things we all need to learn to do. We get angry, and even though we know we're right? We know we're right, but we need to learn to walk away. It's sometimes not worth trying to win that argument. And so, emotions are good. They help us be social beings, but we can look at them rationally, and we can use them rationally. And if we can understand how our emotions affect us, and how our emotions affect others, and they us, I think we can, as a community, get on a lot better. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. We're not going to have time for questions. We want to move right on to the next session. Very sorry. I know. Okay, 2 questions?
Okay.
Well, let's make, because I think Michael might have to come and set up, so we'll take a couple minutes for that. So did you have a question?
I did.
You forgot it?
You forgot, Mark forgot.
That was the next hand I saw in the back.
Hi, thank you. Do you think that evolution would select a counter adaptation for men or for women, for men taking women's signals more than they were
it
meant?
already has. It's already done that. Yeah. Oh, yeah. That was a long time ago. No, I mean women. Women tend to be much more cautious, and we women in general. And again, I'm going to say it's, I'm not talking about individuals. I'm talking about just as a group. Women will become worried with approaches, and I think that women then can react when maybe a guy really is just being friendly, can perhaps become more frightened, and that's something that men probably should be aware of, that it's a situation where a woman might feel uncomfortable, and that's important to realize on both sides. So yeah, women do have these counter responses, and women are much we set our signaling much higher, so we don't necessarily interpret a man's smile as being anything sexual. So that is another way that women have countered that. We kind of ignore the signal, basically. And women also can do that look of death. You know the one, guys? I mean, the look of, you even came up and talked to me look, right? I mean, women, I've seen that in young female children. It's like, how did they learn that look? Don't even, but so yeah, I mean, women can certainly give off really strong signals. One of the things that I recommend to women is to be much more direct with men. Men can handle the directness, and women tend to not want to be as direct because we want to be socially accepted and we want to be really nice. But really, there would be far less problems if women were just very direct and said, "I'm sorry, I'm not interested." So, yeah.
Another question?
Unfortunately, I don't know too much about the evolutionary biology of emotions between sexes, but how well do we know that these behaviors are so firmly rooted in the genetic differences between sexes. I mean, there's so much about the way men or boys and girls are socialized differently to respond to the various types of signals that you talked about. I mean, how well do we know which part is stronger? I mean, you know, of course, the nature versus nurture problem, but like, where is the genetic evidence come from?
There's always going to be, it's not nature versus nurture. I'm going to correct that right now.
Okay, thank you.
It is always nature and nurture.
Yeah,
Okay, I know, but it's a very key point to make, because there's always going to be influences from both. One way of looking at it, I mean, culture did not just spring out of nowhere, right? So we look at cultural differences, and we often highlight, you know, very specific differences, but what we find across cultures are much more similarities than we find differences, which would point to a which points to a more genetic issue. Plus, we can do comparative studies with other animals, and we see behaviors that are different. We see across species, females tend to be pickier than men in terms of
for mate selection.
Okay. And that creates some behavioral differences between males and females. And only in the species where the males are actually raising the offspring do we see the opposite, like the hakanda and seahorses and pipefish, where we see males being much pickier than females, and females being incredibly aggressive.
Okay.
So it's things like that that give us that information that give us an idea that there's got to be a genetic component, because we evolve from other creatures.
Okay, thank you.